Record. There we go.
All right, I'll go ahead and share my screen and get the presentation going. Okay, hopefully you can see the full screen with the full slide. Look okay, Jerry?
Yes, perfect. It's
All
perfect.
right, great. So as Jerry mentioned, I'm Amber Johnstone, and I have been with the ALS Association since 2018, which it just doesn't seem like it's been that long. So I'm fortunate that I enjoy my job. And I'm gonna, again, talk on a guide to advanced directives and why they matter. And Jerry already did a lovely introduction, but you can see some fun pictures on here. So I live in Ohio, near Youngstown, which if you're familiar with Ohio at all, I'm kind of right on the border of Ohio and Pennsylvania. So right on the eastern border. And I work remotely from my home. And I have two little ones. I have a son named Austin and a daughter named Addie. And then my husband and my furry coworker Winnie, who I've had to put up in her kennel because otherwise she'll start barking around this time in the afternoon. We have lots of squirrels and groundhogs and all kinds of things out near our house this time of year, and she thinks she's going to catch them all. So hopefully we won't hear from her, but she's a good companion during the day. So advanced directives are a tough conversation to have, but a really important one. And I love this quotation. It says, conversations about things we can't control can actually help to give us a sense of control. And I think that relates really well to ALS. We talk about how ALS oftentimes is an illness where you lose control over so many things. And it can feel like you lose control of just about everything. And while we can't control when death comes, we can, if we talk about it early, control kind of what that looks like and what happens to us while we're approaching that time in our life. And so even though it can be uncomfortable and sometimes a sad and a little distressing conversation, it can help us to take back some of that control and can help us feel like we do get a choice in what happens. So that's why it can be so important. A little bit about what advanced directives are. So advanced directives is actually an umbrella term. It's kind of a broad explanation of a bunch of different documents and choices that you can make. But what they are is they're legal instructions that explain your preferences for medical care if you get to a point in your life where you're ever unable to make or express those decisions for yourself. Those documents vary state to state, but they are legally valid across the US. So for example, Ohio, we have specific documents for advanced directives. Now, if I'm living in Ohio, I'm going to fill out the Ohio advanced directives. It wouldn't make sense for me to fill out another state. But if I'm traveling to another state, my Ohio documents would be valid wherever I am, as long as I'm carrying them with me. And another important thing to know about advanced directives is they can be changed at any time. They can also be revoked, meaning you can take them back and say, I changed my mind. They can, you can change decisions that are on the documents, you can update them, and they don't expire. So that's a good thing to know too, that people can do an advanced directive really at any time in their life once they're over the age of 18, and they don't ever expire. So it's a nice thing to kind of do and have done and take comfort in knowing that your wishes have already been documented. Who should have an advanced directive? Well, as I mentioned, anyone over the age of 18 should really have an advanced directive. So even if you're healthy, it's a good idea to do these so that if something happens suddenly, others will know what your wishes are. We saw this happen quite a bit with the pandemic. People who were otherwise very healthy, young, had never had any issues or concerns to worry about, were suddenly in a position where they were critically ill and they may not be able to tell someone what they want. And so that's why it can be so important to have these documents. It also makes sense to have these documents, of course, if you have a chronic condition. The difference is that if you have a good understanding of your condition and what to expect as that condition progresses, you may have more details and specific examples of things that might happen that might not happen to somebody who doesn't have that illness. And so you may have details about how you want to be cared for differently than somebody who doesn't have your illness. And of course, if you have a serious illness or your condition is terminal and you don't have long to live, it can be even more important to have these things documented. In those two situations, it can also be important to consider medical orders. And there are certain medical orders that are considered underneath that umbrella term of advanced directives. So we'll talk a little more about those too. So here's a nice little graphic that kind of shows that umbrella that I was talking about. So we've got the general term of advanced directives, and then these are some of the documents that fall under that umbrella. The two main ones, the ones that people are usually most familiar with, are the healthcare power of attorney and the living will. So those two documents kind of go hand in hand, and they do generally make up what we call advanced directives. So the healthcare power of attorney allows you to choose a person to be in charge of making or upholding your decisions if you're ever unable to communicate those. The living will more spells out specific medical care that you would want or not want to be used to extend or sustain your life. Two other things that are often included are organ and tissue donation preferences. So some states actually have a statewide registry. And so that document can often be included with advanced directives, but it'll specifically allow you to outline your wishes regarding what you would want to be donated, or if you don't want to be an organ or tissue donation donor at all. And then finally are those medical orders I mentioned. Sometimes people kind of forget about these, or the only one they really think about is a DNR, a do not resuscitate order. So medical orders are different from the first three documents I mentioned because these are actually physician orders. So just like a prescription for a medication or a piece of equipment, these are medical orders that a physician writes and places on your medical record. So that may include things like I mentioned, a DNR, a post, and I'll talk more about a post in a little bit here, but that is a medical set of orders, so multiple orders. Could also include things like whether or not you would want antibiotics if you had a serious infection, or requests not to be transferred to the emergency department, and also pain management. And so there's a little caveat with the medical orders, is though that even though we recommend that you have a healthcare power of attorney and a living will, they're not required in order for you to have these medical orders in place. So there are situations where people may choose to have these medical orders like a DNR, but they don't choose to have a healthcare power of attorney or living will. So I always like to make that point. Excuse me, I'm getting over a head cold, so I'll try to keep the sniffles at bay. So a little more detail about a healthcare power of attorney. Like I mentioned, it's a legal document that allows you to choose someone to make or uphold your medical wishes. Something important to know is that this is not the same as a financial power of attorney. So most of the time, these two documents are completely separate. There's a healthcare power of attorney that just pertains to medical decisions. And then some people will also choose to have a financial power of attorney. I have seen in some instances where if someone chooses to work with an attorney, somebody who specializes in estate planning or elder law, sometimes the attorney will draw up a document that actually includes both the healthcare power of attorney and the financial power of attorney. But in general terms, if you are completing the healthcare power of attorney on your own, because it does not require an attorney, that is just for medical decisions. I'm gonna sound like a broken record, but each state has their own document. So it's important to know that the state that you reside in, that is the state's documents that you need to be doing. The person that you choose in your healthcare power of attorney is often referred to as a healthcare agent or a healthcare proxy. And then you, as the individual completing the healthcare power of attorney, is usually referred to as the principal in the document. You can often choose more than one person, or you can choose a main person and an alternate. So that's a good idea to do, just because we never know what's going to happen to someone in their life, or if someone's going to be unavailable when when a medical person needs to contact them. So it can be good to denote your primary healthcare agent and then also a secondary or a backup. The document can be heavily customized. Most states' documents have a big section that really just allows you to write whatever details that you want to be included in the healthcare power of attorney. So I've seen people write in that section things like, if I ever have to go to a nursing home, I want to be considered for this nursing home and this nursing home. Or I would really like someone to include this person in the discussions. So even though they're not one of your healthcare agents, you can ask that somebody be included in discussions. It's, like I mentioned before, important to know that they're revocable at any time. So if you make a decision to do this, it is not set in stone. It can be changed, it can be taken back, or it can be updated anytime. Another really important thing to talk about is the fact that this document doesn't go into effect until you are incapacitated or determined otherwise unable to make your own decisions. So some people are afraid that if they do this and they name a person as their healthcare agent, will that person automatically be able to make decisions for me now? No, as long as you're considered of sound mind, you're able to make your own decisions. You are your own person. So this document only comes into play if you're incapacitated. And communication barriers do not automatically enact this document. With ALS, we know that communication can change, and it can change rapidly. So there may be somebody who's no longer able to communicate verbally with their voice, but that doesn't mean that they're incapacitated or unable to make their own decisions. So keep that in mind too, that just because you may not be able to speak your own wishes does not mean that your healthcare power of attorney has to speak for you at that time. You should also know that a healthcare power of attorney ends at death. So some people think that, well, I have a healthcare power of attorney. So after I die, if there need to be decisions made about funeral home or to settle my accounts, that person can do that. With a healthcare power of attorney, that's not the case. The healthcare power of attorney ends at death. So that's why it can also be important to have someone else in charge of your affairs, something like a financial power of attorney. A living will is the next document that we like to talk about in advanced directives. A living will specifically talks about what kind of care you do or do not want at the end of your life. And there is usually a definition included in each document, and it pretty much says the same thing from state to state. But basically what it says is that in order for the living will to be active, you have to be in a permanently unconscious state, or you have to be determined terminal and unable to voice your own wishes. So this document is really for the future, when you get to a point where you're permanently unconscious and there's no chance for recovery. Again, it varies from state to state, but the decisions that are outlined in this document talk about things that would be considered life-sustaining. So things that are going to keep somebody alive and may support them artificially. So we're talking about things like artificial nutrition and hydration. So if you don't have a feeding tube and you can't eat by mouth anymore, would you want one placed? If you already have a feeding tube, but you get to a point where you're permanently unconscious and you're not going to recover, do you want that nutrition to continue? Do you want to be able to have hydration? Do you want a machine to help breathe for you? And do you want to be resuscitated? So that's where we talk more about CPR. That actually has its own document that we'll talk about too. But on this document, you're given the opportunity to kind of pick and choose what things you would want or not want to happen in a situation like this. You also, on this form, identify an individual to kind of be in charge of upholding and overseeing that your wishes are met. In some states, the document is kind of combined with the healthcare power of attorney, so you only have to identify one person if you want to. For the state of Ohio, it's actually 2 separate documents, and you can identify a different person on each one. Most of the time, people tend to choose the same individual, though. I mentioned the organ, tissue, and body donation. So most states' advanced directives include the ability for you to determine whether or not you would want to be an organ and tissue donor. So I mentioned that a lot of times there's an opportunity for you to be placed on the state's registry if you're not already. But the thing to remember is that even if you choose at the time when you're completing your advanced directives that you would want to be a donor, it's not always possible to be a donor. So that's something that's determined at the time of death. And in most instances, even though somebody may fill out an advanced directive that includes these wishes, typically the doctor or the hospital or wherever somebody passes away, usually the family is still consulted about this decision. So something that somebody can do if they're really, really passionate about wanting to be an organ or tissue donation, or they really are passionate about wanting to donate their body to science for research, is that they can make those plans ahead of time. So you can talk to your care coordinator about it, or if you work with a social worker through another agency, you can talk with that person about what your options are for pre-arranging or pre-registering for body donation. Do not resuscitate orders. So do not resuscitate orders are usually referred to as a DNR. That's most commonly what people know them as. And this refers to something called your code status. A code status is a medical order, something that a doctor does for you. If you don't have anything, you don't have a DNR, then your code status is what's called full code. So that means that if you have a medical emergency where your heart or your lungs are affected, you want everything done possible to keep your heart and lungs doing what they're supposed to do. So you want your heart beating and you want your lungs breathing. I mentioned this is a medical order that's signed by a doctor. So even though we talk about do not resuscitate orders amongst advanced directives, this isn't a form that you complete yourself. You might have a form that allows you to kind of denote what your wishes are or what you would want your code status to be, but it still requires a physician order for it to go into effect. And the whole point of this document is that it instructs medical providers not to provide resuscitation in the event that your heart stops beating or you stop breathing. Something that is oftentimes a myth when it comes to DNRs is that they're not going to do anything for you at all. So we always like to say that a DNR does not mean do not treat. So at the very kind of most basic level, if you have a DNR and you've decided that you don't want any non-natural things to stop you from passing away, you're still going to be provided with comfort care treatment. So comfort care may include things like pain medication or oxygen, or even something as simple as raising the head of your bed to make it a little easier for you to breathe on your own. So comfort care is always going to be provided, whether you have a DNR or not. And then treatable conditions are still managed. So if you have a DNR and you break your leg, obviously they're still going to treat your broken leg and they're going to do all of the things they need to do to get you going again. Or if you have any kind of reversible condition, you're generally going to have treatment for those things. This really only has to do with somebody who is very, very critically ill and their heart is going to stop or they're going to stop breathing. Some states also have different levels of code status. I'm obviously most familiar with Ohio, and Ohio is a little special. We have 2 different code status levels, and they can be really confusing. So for the sake of time, I'm not going to go into the details of it because I don't know how many people are here from Ohio. But if at the end of the conversation today, if anybody is here from Ohio and wants to know in more detail about those, pop it in the chat and I'm happy to talk more about it. In addition to those medical orders that I talked about for the DNR is something called a POLST. So POLST is an acronym for Physician Orders for Life-Sustaining Treatment. In most states, the POLST includes the DNR. It's not something that always stands on its own. It can, but there's a big push for this POLST form to be used. It's actually not just a form, it's also a process and kind of a decision-making and conversation that you have with your doctor. There's currently legislation to make this a national standard so that the POLST kind of encompasses all of those medical orders for any life-sustaining treatment. And the idea is that there's one form for every state across the United States, and it would be a standardized thing. All doctors would receive the same training on it. It is something that's active in a lot of states, but not all states have adopted it currently. So right now, I think there are 4 states that have not adopted the POLST or something similar. Of course, Ohio is one of those states. We have not adopted anything similar to the POLST yet. So there are different names, which makes it even more confusing, which is why there's this big push to make it a nationally standardized process. But in other states, and in most of the states in our territory, it's not called the POLST, it's called a POST, a MOST, or a MOLST. So as if they could have made that any more confusing, right? I'll show you a map on the next slide that kind of tells at what level or where these things are being used. But I mentioned Ohio, we currently have very limited use of it. So what these are portable medical orders, and they're signed by a physician and they're permanently placed in your medical record. So in your medical record, a lot of times that exists digitally now. So in the computer system, a doctor is going to be able to pull up and see what medications do you take? And along with those medications, these other orders are going to show up, and they're going to be in there as specific directions about how you should be cared for. That's important because if there's a medical emergency, we generally don't plan those things, and we may not be at home. We may not be near a hospital where our doctor goes. And so the good thing about the POLST is it travels with you. As long as it is on your medical chart and the physician can access your medical chart or your medical record, these orders are going to be in there. The thing about the POLST that's different from the other documents that I mentioned as an advanced directive is that a POLST is not something that healthy individuals are going to complete. So we're not going to want these medical orders to be in your chart if you're a healthy individual who really doesn't have any kind of chronic or life-limiting issues. But for somebody that does have a serious illness, this is a good thing to talk to your doctor about. It typically includes things like CPR, whether or not you would want that, where you would want to be cared for. So do you want to be kept at home comfortable? Would you want to go to the hospital? If you do go to the hospital, do you want them to put you on the ICU, or do you want to stay on a regular floor? What kinds of treatments do you want? Would you want them to help you breathe artificially if you needed it? Would you want serious antibiotics if you had an infection that could potentially shorten your life? Would you want that medically assisted nutrition that I talked about? So I mentioned that even though this is not a document that is used across the country, if it's not widely used in your state, it can still be a really good tool to use when you're having a conversation about this with your doctor. So later on, I've got some resources, and there's a guide in there about the POLST, and it's actually a printable guide that you can take with you to your doctor, and you can say, hey, I'd like to talk about putting these things on my medical record. So even if you're in a state that doesn't use the POLST, you can still use the general format as a tool to have a conversation with your doctor. So here's that map that I mentioned. This is as of February 22, so it is a little old, but I think it is the most updated. And you can see that most of the territories in our area do have statewide use of a POLST, or if it's got a different name, they've still got some version of the POLST. And then you can see that Ohio doesn't. But you can see kind of the progress that they're making as far as making this a standardized document. So I just thought that was kind of a neat visual. So let's say you've done your advanced directives. What next? Where should you store them? It's important that your original document be kept somewhere safe but easily accessible. And you want to make sure that it's kept safe from things like theft, fire, or flood. So it's a good idea to keep it in, you can get those lockable boxes that are fireproof. So you'd want to keep it with other important documents, things like your social security cards and your birth certificates and your passports and your whatevers. So you want to keep that. And then copies should be made. So a copy should be provided to anyone who's named on the document as an agent or a proxy decision maker. You want to make sure that you let somebody know if you've chosen them to be your healthcare power of attorney. You'd be amazed. We actually had situations where that would happen, where we'd go to contact a healthcare power of attorney that's documented on an advance directive, and they had no idea that they were this person's healthcare decision maker. So it's important that if you choose somebody to be your medical agent, that you make sure they have a copy of the document. You should also make sure that your primary care physician has a copy, and you should ask that it be scanned into your medical record. So I mentioned medical records are all digital now, so it can be important that you have this paper document turned into a digital record. If you travel a lot in a vehicle, you should also consider keeping a copy of it in your vehicle. And you should, another thing you might want to consider is keeping an envelope labeled advance directives. And you can actually tape it near your front door or on your refrigerator. So the reason we say this is that a lot of times first responders are trained to look in these areas for advance directives. They're usually looking to see if these things are visible somewhere. And so you might want to put your advance directives in there, any medications, anything that would really be pertinent to a medical provider to have or a first responder to have. You can put all of those in the same envelope and tape it somewhere that would be easily found by a first responder. So what happens if I don't have an advance directive? You'd probably be surprised. So there was a study that was done, I think last year when I looked at it, and it was done by the National Institute of Health. And it showed that only about 1/3 of Americans currently have an advance directive, which it's probably not surprising. Usually when you talk to somebody, unless they already have a serious medical condition, they don't have an advance directive done. But there's a really large push through the medical community, especially through the hospital systems, to improve that number and to get more people to do advance directives. So what happens if you don't have one? Well, medical providers won't know if you have specific wishes about how to be cared for, so that might impact your care in a medical emergency. Just because you don't have one doesn't mean they're not going to ask somebody. So each state has kind of a decision tree about who gets to make the decision if you haven't picked anyone to make it. Most states use a next of kin law, and so it kind of depends on who is determined your next of kin in your state. But for the most part, it usually falls to a spouse, an oldest child, or in Ohio, it's actually the children collectively. It's not just the eldest child, it's the children collectively. And then a parent, I think next is siblings, and then grandchildren, and it kind of goes down the line. So if you don't have anyone chosen, they're going to ask whoever your next of kin is, or whoever they can, communicate with. They're going to try to find your next of kin, and they're going to try to go down the line until they find somebody who is able to speak with them. So because of that, you can imagine communication is most important about this. So if you don't have an advance directive and you decide for whatever reason that it's not for you and you don't want to do one, you need to tell somebody what your wishes are. Somebody close to you needs to know. If you don't talk about it, your doctors just aren't going to know what to do. And they're going to make their best guess. They're going to try to act in your best interest, but it may not be what you wanted for yourself. You should also think really carefully about who you're going to choose as your medical decision maker. So sometimes our next of kin is not always emotionally going to be the person that's able to uphold our wishes. I worked in hospice for a long time before I took this job, and we saw this a lot, where a spouse was just really not able to let somebody pass away, or they really had a lot of internal angst about it. And that's that's not uncommon to imagine. You can imagine how somebody in that position may feel. So sometimes your next of kin isn't the best person to be your healthcare decision maker. It's still important to have those conversations, though. And of course, talk to your medical providers. Make sure that your doctor, especially your primary care provider, but maybe your neurologist or your pulmonologist, make sure they know what your wishes are, because they will at least be able to document it in your medical chart that they had a conversation with you about this. So I promised some resources, and I've actually got a slide on here that's got links, and I'll talk to Jerry about how we can get that out to everybody. But there are some resources available to guide your conversation about this so that you're not just sitting down and blindly kind of filling out an advance directive. There are some things that you can use, some resources out there to help you understand what it is that you're choosing, what it is that you're writing on this document, and how to talk about it with your family members. So there's something called 5 wishes, and this is actually recognized in some states as an advance directive in and of its own. I don't believe, and Jerry, you can jump in and correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't believe it's legally recognized in our area, our territory. But it is a really nicely written document that helps you kind of easily understand what is in an advance directive, and it helps you express what your wishes are. As nice as it is, it's not free. It's for purchase. It's not horribly expensive. It's like $25, but it is out there and it's a nice one. There's another one called Conversations That Light the Way. And this was one that was developed in combination with a hospice organization. And this one's free, and it's a workbook that helps guide you through advanced planning. So it actually kind of lays out some scenarios and says, imagine this, and what would you want to happen in this scenario? Similarly, there's a website called the Conversation Project, and this is put forth by the Institute for Healthcare Improvement. Sorry. It is a project to help people talk about their wishes at the end of life. And this one is actually not just for adults. There's actually some guides for children who may have a life-limiting illness and how they can have conversations as well. So it's a little more broadly focused, but it's really nice, and it's got a lot of great resources on it. And then finally, another one I found is one that's called Prepare for Your Care. And it's actually a step-by-step guide on how to complete your advance directives. And this one's really nice for anybody who's not so tech savvy. It's got some really nice videos and some kind of very basic step-by-step walks you through how to even click through the website. So it's a nice resource as well. Here's that resource slide with all of the links I mentioned. So the one on the very top is actually a link for you to find your state's advance directives. So it's a nice little search engine. There's a drop-down menu and it gives you all the states, and you pick yours and it takes you right to your document. And so you can download and print your document for free to complete. And then similar for the POST. So the POST is not a form that we as non-medical providers can fill out ourselves. It's that the POST is a form that, like I mentioned, a doctor does. But this link that I have is a guide for patients to take to their doctor. So if a doctor says, oh, I don't use POST, or I've never used it before, you can take this guide with them. And even if they don't use the POST, it will help kind of walk them through what medical orders would be included in a POST and how to kind of place them in your medical chart. I've also got a link to the 5 wishes, Conversations Light the Way, and then the Conversation Project and the Prepare. The one thing I didn't talk about was what you need to complete those advance directives. So the healthcare power of attorney and the living will. I mentioned briefly that you do not have to, an attorney, a lawyer, doesn't have to complete these. So most states, you either have to have it signed by 2 non-related witnesses. So you yourself have to sign it. And then 2 witnesses need to sign that they saw you do this and that you are of sound mind and you're making your own decisions. So that's what they're signing. They're not signing that they agree with your wishes or they agree what you've written down. They are simply signing that they witnessed you yourself sign the document and that you're doing it of your own free will. If you don't have two non-related witnesses, there is also a section you can have it notarized. So you can take it to a notary and complete it there as well. But for most states, any two non-related witnesses are fine. And then there's some references for the information. Here's my contact info. Jerry, we got through that pretty darn quick. So I don't know if there have been questions, but I'm happy to take any questions if anyone has them.
All right. I do not see any questions, but I'm going to be honest with you. I think it's probably because you did such a good job covering everything. And I will tell you 5 wishes, which I love. I really, because it's an easy, it's not so medically confusing, the terminology and everything. I really like it. It is valid in Virginia and some states, I think like West Virginia and South Carolina, you might have to get it notarized, but you're right. It's Ohio, maybe you guys are just funny.
We're special.
You're special.
I know it is. I worked because I'm so close to the border. When I did hospice work, we covered part of Pennsylvania, and that document's heavily used in Pennsylvania. That's what they use as their living will. So that's where I became familiar with it. And it is, I hate that it's not free, but you can, it's really reasonable. But yeah, it is a really nice document because it does, you're right. It uses non-medical terms.
So what we can do is the 1 page with the references. I really like that. We can send that page out on, send it to the care service coordinators, and then they can just send it out. If I want to make sure the folks on here have it. So would it be easier for them just to shoot me an email, shoot you an email? How do you think the best way to?
Either way is fine.
Okay. So guys, you can, if you're interested and you're on this call, you can, does chat work with this? Okay, to host and panelist. I have a bigger screen over here because which is why I'm not ignoring people. It's just that my eyes are too small for this small computer. I just can't do it. All right, you guys, my email is in the chat, but I will also tell it to you if you don't see the chat in there. It is Jerry, which is JERI .P as in Paul, R as in rabbit, O, S as in Sam, S as in Sam, ER @ALS.org. I think that sounds pretty good. We do have a question. Oh,
okay,
no,
I'm gonna
it's a
type it
comment. It's a comment. They can't see the chat.
That's okay. I'm gonna type it in.
Okay.
And Prosser's too. Yep. Perfect. So
Yeah.
I just put it in. I'll put mine in too.
Okay. That shows how much I know about the system.
The webinars are kind of, it's different than a thing. Did that pop up? It did. Okay.
So it says that Pete has a question. His hand is up. I'm going to allow Pete. You should be able to talk if I know how to drive this machine.
Thank you. I just joined, but would you please repeat your email again so that way we can jog it down again?
I will be glad to. It's JERI .P as in Paul, R as in rabbit, O, S as in Sam, S as in Sam, ER @ALS.org.
Thank you.
No problem at all. I always say the S's because some reason people think I say F. So, okay. And if I knew how to make your hand go away, I would, but I'm not that good. So, okay. Let's see, any other, I don't see any, okay. I don't see any questions. I'm gonna just ask if anybody has a question before we end, put it in the Q&A, but if you shoot me an email, we will make sure that you get the information. If you have any questions, I can make sure they get to who knows what they're talking about. And Amber, thank you so much. I really, really appreciate it. This was a very important webinar, very important information. I wanted to let folks know that next month on the 16th of November, we're going to be having a webinar about nutrition care. So looking forward to that one too. If we do not, I'm going to check it one more time. Nope, we do not have any questions. So, Amber, I'm going to say, if you don't have any last words of wisdom, we will call it an afternoon.
Nope. Take 15 minutes back and enjoy your afternoon. And thanks for having me.
Yeah, thank you so much. And once again, thank you everybody for attending. Some really great information today, and we will make sure that the information gets sent out. And y'all have a very good day. Okay? Thank you so much, y'all. See you next month.